Tom Keough was a huge influence on me. Not just an influence on my art, but an influence on my politics and an influence on my personal moral decisions. Um, I think it's fair to say that Tom Keough was a role model to me. I don't know if this is true for other people, but I suspect there are some people besides myself who might feel that way about Tom. Of all Tom's illustrations, this one has always been my favorite. Um, it's a very disturbing picture. Um, it's not just that the gun has been made into a person, and it's not just that the gun is about to eat children. Um, the gun has a very specific personality and a very specific expression. I feel like Tom knows this person. I feel like Tom knows this gun. Um, I've tried to do a drawing like this many times, and I've never quite been able to pull this off. Um, Tom seems to have grown up around a lot of violence. I could never keep all the stories straight. He very often told them in the wrong order. Um, he grew up in what I guess was a small town in Connecticut. And describes a lot of racist violence in his childhood. Apparently, some members of his family were Nazis or Klan members or some kind of white supremacist, although not all the people in his family. But it was very disturbing for him and affected him a great deal. But there was also another side to Tom and another aspect to his background. Um, Tom had apparently gone to a very progressive Catholic school where he'd been exposed to ideas of liberation theology. Um, and this had had a very positive effect on him. Here you can see one of his drawings where he shows, that if um, Mary and Joseph had, you know, had the baby Jesus today, they would be homeless people living in a dumpster. Um, and so it's an evocation of Christian imagery and Christian morality, but also of urban poverty. Um, Tom is one of the few people I've ever met who had fond memories of Catholic school. And apparently, this combination of exposure to violence and racism and a Catholic progressive morality led Tom to become politically active. One of the first groups he was involved in was the Shad Alliance, which was an anti-nuclear organization working in rural areas around the tri-state area, um, trying to prevent the building of nuclear power plants and to close down the existing ones. He was also involved in the War Resisters League, which was an anti-war and anti-nuclear organization, which specifically espoused nonviolence and taught Gandhi's techniques of nonviolent civil disobedience. And this gave Tom a way of affecting the world. But that's not the only thing he got from political activism. The groups that Tom was involved with gave him something that is really valuable to a young artist in their 20s. They gave him a place to publish his work in the many newspapers and magazines that were being produced by the pacifist left in 1979, 1980, 1981. Um, Tom worked for a number of papers, the Nonviolent Activist, Win Magazine, a whole list of them, the Guardian News Weekly. In fact, Tom was the first person I knew of my own generation who was working regularly as an illustrator for all of these left-wing newspapers, most of whom did pay him something for this work. And his work appeared regularly and was seen by hundreds and thousands of people. Under ideal conditions, I believe this is what Tom Keough's illustrations would have looked like. This drawing was his business card, and you can see it's in a style that was very popular for illustrators in the 1970s. He uses a lot of layers of cross-hatching to get a full range of grays from white to black. Um, and there's a lot of detail and a lot of research going into it. So I think under ideal conditions, this is what Tom Keough's illustration work would have looked like. But Tom was not working under ideal conditions. Tom was working for the American left in the 1980s. That meant you had short deadlines, there were often last-minute revisions in your work, and you were paid little or nothing. So you had to have another job as well as doing this illustration work. Um, and that meant you had to be able to work very quickly and turn things over very simply. And I think every one of us who worked for left-wing publications in the early 1980s found some workaround where we could produce artwork very fast, and so did Tom. What you did get from working for the American left at that time was a whole lot of interesting stuff to make pictures of. This is apparently a drawing about a march that goes from the site of the Auschwitz concentration camp to the site of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, um, and travels through South Africa and is led by Buddhist monks. I do know there was such a march that took place in the 1990s. I don't know if this illustration was made for that march or if there was some other context, but it is a really interesting thing to draw a picture of. Here's a piece that Tom did about an incident that disturbed a lot of us, which is that Ronald Reagan went to Bitburg, Germany in 1985 and memorialized a number of SS officers and put wreaths on their grave. So here, you know, Reagan is reviving the spirit of fascism, which is coming out of the grave like a zombie. Um, and as an American Jew, I grew up learning that Henry Ford was a Nazi, that Lindbergh was a Nazi, that the fathers of George W. Bush, Donald Trump, and Elon Musk were all Nazis. And most other Americans don't seem to know this. Or if they do know this, it's not very important to them. Tom Keough was one of the few Christians I met who understood the significance of this. He was always very aware that there were Nazis running this country. On a more positive note, this is a piece Tom did about liberation theology, which was an important religious and political movement in Latin America in the 1980s. And here you see a picture that has the main church in Managua, Nicaragua. And Tom was very inspired by both Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King and the idea that you could change the world through nonviolence. Now, a lot of people in the United States don't really understand the idea of nonviolence in the way that Tom did. I don't want to say that Tom just believed you could change the world by being a nice guy. Tom Keough was a revolutionary, but he believed that society needed to change fundamentally, but he believed that change could be accomplished nonviolently. I met Tom when we were both students at Pratt Institute of Art in Brooklyn. Um, at that time, Ronald Reagan was becoming president and threatening to drop the atomic bomb on Russia. And this is something that Tom and I were both very concerned about. But we found that most of the students on our campus were not really interested in what was going on politically. In fact, there was a peace group on our campus that consisted of 5 people. That's what the 1980s were like. Young people in the 1980s, particularly in New York, particularly at the beginning of the 1980s, were not political. And Tom was one of the few political people I met when I was in college. I believe Tom Keough introduced me to Ben Hillman, a friend of his who did the cover of the first issue of my magazine, World War III Illustrated, which Tom was very interested in. And Tom also helped raise money to pay for printing of the second issue of World War III Illustrated. And this is the first piece Tom did for World War III Illustrated. It's a collaboration between myself and Tom on the artwork and my girlfriend at the time, Eve Kasner, who wrote the script. And it's kind of an odd piece. I don't think it's a great piece at all. It has this kind of mixture of influence. It's sort of like half Frank Frazetta and half Kathy Kollwitz, you know. It's combining what we knew from comic books with what we knew from political art, and it's done using a technique called duo shade paper, graphic arts material that is almost unheard of now. Nobody uses it anymore, but we drew a couple pieces on duo shade paper together. We also collaborated on illustrations for this article for Cultural Correspondence. And Tom Keough got me work because he had all these connections with anti-war and anti-nuclear and social justice magazines. So he got me work with Win magazine, who needed somebody to illustrate an article about um, the illegal police chokehold. And I did this drawing, which is the first drawing I ever did about the subject of police brutality, which would become one of the major themes in my work over the years. And I wouldn't have started drawing this subject material if it hadn't been for Tom Keough. This is a book Tom and I worked on together. We did this for um, some Maryknoll Catholic missionaries, and it was a training manual for missionaries who were going to Latin America, and it was to teach them about the Cold War and to help them understand that they shouldn't be recruited to work as spies for the Central Intelligence Agency. And they needed about 100 illustrations for this book, and they were ready to pay us like $10 a page, $10 a drawing. So we had to knock these out really fast if we were going to make any type of living illustrating this book. And you can see that we developed a very simplified drawing style that allowed us to work quickly. Um, And this type of simplification that I developed for this book is something I would use for the rest of my life in a lot of my more propaganda-oriented political work, where, of course, you're working for organizations that don't have a big budget, that can't compensate you for your time and need things done very quickly anyways. So I had to find a simple way of working. Um, and I learned that working with Tom on this project. But Tom gave me a lot more than some job experience. In 1983, Tom and I were in a very small demonstration in the Times Square area, and this was a protest against the U.S. invasion of the island of Grenada. And as you can see here, there's a small number of us protesting and a lot of people on the street who really don't care all that much. So we're marching along, and all of a sudden, Tom steps out of line and he sits down in front of a bus and he wants to block traffic. And he's come up with this plan to block traffic all by himself. And, he's going to be a one-man protest and stop the war. And eventually, the organizers convinced him not to do this. But he didn't give up there. He wanted to stop the war machine and he wanted to do it with civil disobedience. And Tom introduced me to the ideas of Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi's notion of nonviolence was not what that word tends to mean when you hear it. We think nonviolence, we think, oh, that means being nice and being quiet and getting along with everybody. And actually, Mahatma Gandhi described nonviolence as a martial art. Um, but it's a martial art different from all other martial arts in that the nonviolent warrior takes responsibility for their actions. Um, you know that somebody is going to get hurt as a result of your actions, and you decide that person is going to be you. So, with Tom's encouragement, I joined a civil disobedience action organized by the War Resisters League that took place in the office of Senator D'Amato and was against the bombing of El Salvador. And that was pretty much my first intentional arrest, and it would be the first of many. So, for the fourth issue of World War III Illustrated, Tom Keough did what I think was a very groundbreaking comic strip, which has influenced my work for years afterwards. Um, it was a comic strip about um, civil disobedience at Riverside Research Institute, which was a an office building that was researching nuclear weapons. And of course, the first word in the title is misspelled. Um, and that's typical of the early issues of World War III. We were young people, we were doing all kinds of things, and we weren't necessarily thinking that thoroughly about anything we were doing, right? And there's a lot of mistakes, there's a lot of crudeness, a lot of roughness in this material. So there's that big misspelling in the most obvious place on the cover. But this comic strip described in detail the nonviolent civil disobedience at Riverside Research Institute. He showed how people would block the doorways, how police would try to clear them out of the doorways, and how some of the incidents became a bit violent and a bit disturbing. and then people would be carried out and arrested. And he shows in detail what this experience was like. And what I think is really significant about this drawing is it's drawn from the point of view of someone who is sitting down in this protest and doing civil disobedience. It's not from the point of view of a journalist who's sitting across the street and watching these kids get arrested. And this was a whole idea of autobiographical activist journalism that was new to me, and I think new to comics at that time. There are now a lot of people who do activist memoirs and comics, and I've actually done a whole book called War in the Neighborhood that's my activist memoir. But this was a new idea to us in comics when Tom did it. But it's more than a memoir. If you look at the text, he says things like, "You are likely to be knocked over. Sitting makes you more stable and harder to move. Only hit back if you are ready to be charged with a felony. The real point here is that you're using up their time and energy." He's giving you advice with the assumption that you're reading this so that you can do it too. Here he's giving you the faces of the guy in the red squad who is likely to bust you. And he says the white-haired lieutenant and this man whispered to each other, "Remember their faces." And here he shows you the desk appearance ticket you're likely to get when you get arrested. And what do you know? This is Tom Keough's desk appearance ticket. He's letting you know, yeah, he did this. He's telling you to do this, and he's done this. And here's a really nice drawing of the paddy wagon that he's going to get dragged into. And it happens to be sitting in front of a church. And I remember asking, "What's the church doing in the drawing?" He says, "Oh, that was in the background." Yeah, it was, but I'm sure there were a lot of other things in the background he didn't put in there. Um, I kind of feel like when I look at this, that Tom Keough is saying that, this paddy wagon was his church. This paddy wagon was where he got close to God. And of course, Christianity comes up again and again and again in Tom's work. In fact, here's a drawing of Reverend Daniel Berrigan, a very important Catholic pacifist priest who was part of these actions. And in fact, Tom was pretty close to the Berrigans for many years. Okay, he ends this comic strip by saying, "What are you doing about nuclear war?" And then he tells you what you can do. He tells you about this demonstration that you can be part of and how to get a hold of the organizers. And this was a demonstration called No Business as Usual, which was a national day of action against nuclear weapons that Tom and I were part of organizing. This is the first demonstration I ever worked on organizing. We organized the New York chapter of No Business as Usual. Um, and I was in charge of organizing what was called an illegal art show, meaning that artists were going to display their work all around the building while Tom and some more experienced activists were blocking the doorways. And here is the contact information where you can reach Tom and bring him your artwork. And of course, Tom's name is misspelled because, God damn it, everything we did back then was misspelled. Um, and I'm imagining that means that Tom Keough was not the one who provided the type for this poster, even though he did the illustration. No Business as Usual was one of the first attempts of the older generation of activists at places like the War Resisters League, the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Yippies, to incorporate the younger generation of people who were part of the punk rock scene into their political work. And um, it was a short-lived attempt. Um, it broke up very quickly because the older activists also had huge sectarian differences with each other. But a lot of the people I met through this action, I would continue to work with for years to come. So Tom uh, also got work at the City Sun, which was a very radical black newspaper that was competing with the Amsterdam News as the black paper in New York City. And a lot of the articles he was hired to illustrate were about police brutality. And this is a comic strip he did for our magazine, World War III Illustrated, also about police brutality. And what he does here is he outlines actual incidents of police brutality. He describes them, he illustrates them, and then he imposes on them photographs from cop shows to contrast what police really do compared to the way they're portrayed in media. So Tom met his first wife, Annie, through work he was doing for Catholic Charities. They were both doing healthcare work for Catholic Charities, and he married her. And this was kind of a bold move for a guy who had some, apparently some pretty extreme racists in his family. And in fact, I went to the wedding and I was one of three white people at the wedding. Tom's family wasn't there. Okay. And the marriage did not last that long because I believe within 2 years of getting married, Annie came out as a lesbian. They divorced, but I never once heard Tom say a bad word about Annie. In fact, Tom did this really lovely comic strip for us about love and about all the different kinds of love that society doesn't support. So here you've got this big Valentine, and inside the Valentine, you've got all these different types of couples. You've got men with men, women with women, uh, black men with white women, white men with black women. And then right below this Valentine, you've got this horrible screaming figure, which I guess is supposed to signify, the racist who's upset that these people are getting together, or maybe it signifies, Tom's angst about all the bad things that happen to people. I'm not sure, but this is obviously a pay stub taken out of this poster for the play Sweeney Todd that was very popular in the 1980s. But it's kind of interesting. He's taken that figure from Sweeney Todd, but in Sweeney Todd, the guy is holding a razor, and he decided to take that knife out of the guy's hand because I guess he thought that was too disturbing for this picture. And at the bottom, there's this inscription that says, when two people are in love, everybody should be glad of it. People should offer a friendly word, some light advice, maybe an anniversary card. With all the problems in today's world, it's really beautiful to see two people in love sharing their hearts and lives. A little supportive kindness, is that too much to ask? And then in the subsequent pages, he has all these little vignettes of how little support people who are in love get. Like this, this guy's family doesn't want him to come back into the apartment because he went out on a date with the wrong type of person. Um, or this guy's father says, "Didn't I teach you to hate them colored folks?" And he says, "No, Pop, you just taught me to hate my parents." Um, or here, this woman can't show her partner to her family. And so he hides around the corner when she goes to visit her family. Or these two women move in together, but then they're in trouble when their landlord finds out that they're lesbians. Or this, I wonder if this is an actual incident. Um, wow, the relatives we didn't invite to the wedding because we thought they would be too bigoted have now sent expensive gifts. Should I feel foolish or confused or happy? And here he talks about how gay people in San Francisco now have work contracts that give their lovers the same medical benefits that the spouse of a straight worker has. So here's Tom Keough, a heterosexual man in New York City, writing in the 1980s, at the height of the AIDS crisis, writing about very practical concerns about medical benefits for gay couples in San Francisco. Okay? So, like, this was not the normal discourse at the time, okay? I mean, Tom was thinking about a lot of stuff. And here is a piece about how great it is to see older people who've stayed together in spite of all the bigotry in society. And this is my favorite. This is the last panel in it, and I think it's really funny. She says, "You know, when I was a kid, my folks told me that the devil has blonde hair and blue eyes. Doesn't that sound crazy?" Heck no. When I was a kid, my folks told me that everybody has blonde hair and blue eyes. So that's Tom. Tom also went to visit Palestine, did a comic strip about it, and this was around 1987. So this is a couple years before Joe Sacco would go to Palestine and produce comics about it. So Tom is arguably the first American cartoonist to go to Palestine and document the conditions there. Um, and he went there, of course, with a group of Catholic and Protestant peace activists who were doing research about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Um, and of course, it shows how hard it is to get into the occupied territories. And then he shows you what he sees when he gets into Gaza, which is all these kids who've been horribly injured by the IDF. And he talks about the first Intifada. And it's interesting to read this now because, of course, the word intifada, we've been told, is this really bad word that nobody's ever supposed to use. But the way Tom describes the first intifada as not just violence, but all kinds of civil disobedience. Um, we stop paying for our oppression. We stop working for the Israelis. We work for ourselves. We have secret ways to distribute food and water, even into curfewed areas. They made schools illegal for Palestinians, so we made secret popular committee schools. We can run our own schools. They close and attack clinics, so we build our own hidden clinics. Our goal, we will do all these illegal activities. Tom also interviews a number of Israelis and gets their point of view, including members of the military who were very disturbed at what they were required to do. He interviewed spokespeople for the Likud and Labor parties, and he makes the point that the whole thing is funded and armed by the United States. And he describes an incident where one of the women he's traveling with um, is very roughly strip searched and apparently sodomized with a metal detector by Israeli guards, a very disturbing incident. And then Tom ends up with a panel saying, "What are we going to do about this?" Which is typical of Tom's work. His comics often end with Tom saying, "What are we going to do about this?" So, autobiographical comics, of course, became a big thing over the years. And we were always very aware that Tom had a very interesting personal story. We could never get it straight, but apparently all kinds of crazy things had happened when he was a kid. And we kept saying, Tom, why don't you do a comic strip about this? And we finally got him to do one, and he only did one. And this was about an incident that happened at Christmas time, and he and his friends are at a Christmas party, and they decide, let's get out of here, let's go out and have an adventure. And they do have an adventure. They're running down the street, and all of a sudden, something is thrown in front of them, and it is a badly injured person. And they quickly discover that this guy has been beaten up by a gang of other guys. And they are gleefully waiting for this guy to bleed to death. So then one of Tom's friend, a kid named Lance McCusick, runs out into the middle of this and he tells them they've got to stop. They've got to get an ambulance. They can't let this guy die. And that's when they find out why these guys were beating the guy up. And Lance confronts them. He says, you probably all call yourself good Christians. What a bunch of lying hypocrites. So again, there's this, connection to Christian morality in Tom's work. And they eventually find a woman in a store and they try to convince her to call an ambulance. And the tough guys, the thugs, threaten her and say that she'd better not call an ambulance. But she decides to call. And here is the phrase, blessed art thou amongst women, which is a reference to the Virgin Mary. And the ambulance comes, and the guy is saved. And then Tom ends saying, sometimes in life you can stand up to the bullies, go against the way people do things. If it is wrong, try to stand up for what is better. Sometimes you'll be afraid of getting hurt, sometimes do it anyway. Keep trying, some days we win. So the one incident from his own life that Tom Keough wants to give us, the one piece of his very difficult childhood, is one where somebody does the right thing and it works. So you see, you can do the right thing and it will work out. So it's a story with a great little moral. So Tom's second wife, Connie, was someone he met doing anti-war work. She was another peace activist who was part of a lot of the same groups Tom was part of. And they got married and they adopted a kid named Luke. And as adopted parents, they could no longer engage in civil disobedience because the laws are pretty strict about people who adopt. You can't be arrested, you can't be convicted, you can lose custody. And so that was a big change in Tom's lifestyle. And Tom and Connie started going out to the country, and Tom started doing these really lovely sort of landscape paintings. Paintings that he put a lot of time and care into. And then he also started doing paintings of the Brooklyn neighborhood he lives in, particularly night scenes. Tom said he liked painting night scenes because the light didn't change, so you could spend all night on one of these paintings. And I'm kind of envisioning Tom sitting here very slowly and carefully and meticulously working on one of these paintings. So he finally could work in the way he wanted to, um, and be as painstaking and perfectionist as he wanted to about these urban landscapes. Very few of these paintings had people in them. So you might look at a painting like this and say, wow, that ought to be in an art gallery, right? That's a really good painting. Well, guess what? Tom's work was in art galleries at this point. Um, the Hellbraum Gallery is a pretty important gallery. They represented the early work of David Wondrovich, and they also represented Tom Keough. Tom also got very involved in doing portraiture. And he told me that he primarily did portraiture from photographs because it was really hard to get people to sit still for the type of detailed work he wanted to do. And when I hear that, I can't help thinking that what that really means is that Tom was way too nice a guy to tell somebody, you gotta sit still, you know? So the only way he could get these type of portraits, he admitted, was from photographs. But Tom also saw that portraiture had a political significance. To do a portrait of somebody is to evoke what that person stood for. And Tom did this series of portraits for our magazine, World War III, where he started out with, very famous people like Mr. James Baldwin or Miss Harriet Tubman or President Nelson Mandela, all of these great heroes. But then he went to the heroes he knows personally. Um, Mr. Wilfred Abelard, a lifelong activist. Miss Phyllis Cunningham, RN, a nurse and activist for over 60 years. Mr. Art Cabrera, electrician and lifelong organizer. And of course, Art Cabrera was the man that Tom shared his house with. As the father of a African American young man, Tom was very concerned about police brutality, and he continued to be politically active on that issue and on all racial issues. And he continued to do art about this. And Tom also continued to do work in this kind of quick style for many different political causes he supported. Tom and Connie and Annie were never liberal Democrats. They were never people who wanted to compromise their politics. Um, if you told Tom and Annie and Connie, if you said, I'd really like you to vote for this Democratic candidate, what they would usually do is they'd say, we really support you in your desire to make the world a better place. We just don't believe the person you want us to vote for really shares your values. And we think you should take a closer look at what they're doing because I think you'll see that they don't really agree with you. They were always critical of the Democratic Party and they were always very civil about it as well. Um, One place where Tom and I really disagreed was that it was really important to him to believe that there had been a successful socialist revolution somewhere in the world. He was inclined to believe the best about the Soviet Union, about the People's Republic of China, about Cuba, um, and about figures like Lenin and Mao and Castro and Mahatma Gandhi. And As a person who'd had the privilege of traveling to Eastern Europe when I was pretty young, I knew that a lot of this stuff just wasn't true. And I would discuss this with him. And we had this conversation many times, and it always ended the same way, as he would say, okay, you're telling me that Russia ain't so great, that China ain't so great, that Cuba ain't so great, that Lenin wasn't so great, that Mao wasn't so great, that Mahatma Gandhi wasn't so great. Well, what does that do for my family back in Connecticut? I want to tell them that there's a better way they can live. And just finding out that Russia ain't so great doesn't help them. And we had that conversation all our lives when Tom was in the hospital. I went to visit him in the hospital. We had that conversation again. And, we continued to agree to disagree on this. And Tom wound up saying to me, he said, I always like to talk to you. You always give me something to think about. So, was Tom Keough this crude, radical political propagandist, or was he this nice fella who painted lovely landscapes for people to hang on their living room wall? I think Tom Keough was a good artist in that Tom made pictures of the right things for the right reasons. Tom was also a good man who did the right things for the right reasons. Last time I talked to Tom, we talked about our histories of political activism. Um, and Tom told me he'd been arrested 15 times. And when I walked away, I thought to myself, wow, I got arrested 30 times. I got arrested more than my role model, Tom Keough. And then I thought, if I hadn't met Tom Keough, I probably wouldn't have gotten arrested once.